Everyone's been very sweet, and today a really good friend of mine said that it's time I redid another video about Cartier watches, and I suddenly realized that it's been quite a long time since I did the last one, and so I'm happy to sit here and welcome you back and hope that I have something that I can share with you that you will find interesting. One of the problems with Cartier watches is at the end of the day there were very few models. So it's not something that we can, with this series of chats, cannot go on ad infinitum, because once we've covered the models, we've covered the models. And but what I want to show you, what I want to share with you today, is something that I find it's such a quirky thing that you're going to look at me probably with a renewed eyes, wondering is something wrong with me. But it is such a strange quirk in Cartier watches. It is fundamentally unnoticed. But to me, it is something very special. Now, this is a model which was made late in the 1970s. It's an adaptation of a model which was originally brought into being by Cartier 921. So it's got a long history. And if you now come over here, I'm going to introduce you to a model which is known as I call it the super thin. I think in the Cartier terms it was known as the super flat. So here I have, ostensibly, I have the famous Cartier Tank LC. This is the most famous of all the Cartier watches. I mean, this is the watch that you see staring at you at ads. This is the watch that is, this is the most famous of the Tank watches. If you go back in the book, I'll show you in the book, if you go back to the original Tank, which was the Tank Normal, I'll just draw your eye to what evolved. This is a good picture to see. What they changed was they had very fat bars, the Tank Normal here, whereas when they made this model, the bars here are very thin. That is actually the only really the difference between the two. This was actually originally called what is it? Arrondi is the word. Arrondi, which is curved corners. But and was introduced in 1921, and in 1924 they christened it the LC Louis Cartier in memory of the father of the firm, and not the complete father of the firm, because he had grandfathers and fathers, but the grandfather of the firm at that time, and probably remains the most elegant of all the watches. Now, why super flat? Why super thin? Let me just take you back to history. In the early days of Cartier's inventing the wristwatch or developing the wristwatch, he had two criteria. Is that one of the criteria was he wanted to make this very elegant watch, but in order to achieve elegance, he wanted to make a case which was very thin. This was his abiding line of attack, really, that any design which developed a fat watch was not what he wanted. He wanted to be very thin and very streamlined. And it was only thanks to his extraordinary association with Edmund Jaeger. Edmund Jaeger was in fact the only watchmaker at the time who said that he could make watches thin enough, watch movements thin enough to satisfy Louis Cartier's dream of making these very thin wristwatches. And then we know the story from there. But it wasn't until 1970 that Cartier was able to get Jaeger-LeCoultre again to make a movement which was thin enough to put into these cases which were known as super flat. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the same watch. Here are the set. They're all exactly the same. I mean, what I always like about these watches, because they were handmade, they all vary a little bit. They have a few quirks. You see the dials slightly differently printed on one. The dials change color on another. But what I'm going to show you, the reason why I've got these is I've got a normal. I've got a. Sorry, I got a normal. I've got a medium, and I've got a super flat. Now I hope on the video you can see what it means. Now even I can see, I'm looking at the video screen myself, actually. This is like a slip, this is like an after 8 mint. This is often mistaken as a super thin, but it's actually not. And this is the standard thickness of the watch. Now, I'm just going to go back a gear again. I'm going to pick up a much, much earlier watch. I'm going to pick up a 1920s Tank Centre. This is, of course, the most famous watch. This is the king of Cartier watches. This was the one which was made this actually was made in the 1920s. And when we look at this watch, we can see even back then, this is a big watch, but this is an incredibly thin case. I mean, it almost defies imagination how at that era of time they could have had a movement which was so thin to go into this case. But of course, the thinness adds to elegance on the wrist. And if it was a great big, huge, chunky thing, it wouldn't be so elegant on the wrist. Now, in this case, the change is so minimal. If I put this on the wrist, you won't in any way know you wouldn't in any way consider that a fat watch. You'd say you would just look at that and say, wow, that is just beautiful on the wrist. I think this is really absolutely divine. It's heaven. It sits really comfortably and it's delightful. It's got all the Cartier characteristics, which we've spoken about before. We have the Roman numerals, we have the chemin de fer, we have the blued steeled hands, we have the sapphire winder, we have the lugs, we have the strap, and of course we have the D-buckle. But then you go to this quirky one, which is the reason for this video, when you get the super thin. And on the wrist, when you put this on the wrist, there is a discernible difference. Now, it is a little bit into anorak territory, and 99% of people who see you wearing this watch will have absolutely no idea at all, but that it is a super thin. They'll think it's the same as all the others. But you, as the wearer, will know that it is super thin. And there is something just really fascinating and endearing, and not endearing, fascinating and I'm not sure what, but just fascinating and charming about this watch. I think this is only I think the movement in here is 1.8 millimeters thick. Now, I'm not a watchmaker, but I know that is really, really unbelievably thin. And this one actually has got an amusing inscription on the back. Someone might even recognize who this is from. It's inscribed KS, Corviglia 1970. Now, these super thins, in theory, were not really introduced until the early 1970s, 72, 73. But the fact that we have one here from 1970, I believe that actually they started making these in 1969, 1968, 1969. And they are unbelievably hard to find. And it's one of those silly things with Cartier watches. There are certain things that you could say to any watch dealer, say, I would like a watch like this, and they can find it for you. You can go into the market and you can look and you can search and you can find it. But if you go in the market and say, I want to buy a Cartier super thin, a lot of people won't even know what you're talking about, but they are impossible to find. And it just is, as I say, I'd be a very happy man to have a normal Tank JC. And the Tank JC was the only model they made in this super thin style. There were no other watches they made which were super thins. But I'd be very happy to own one of these, and many people do, and that is the be all and end all. But it is nice to be able to share with you that Cartier did make these very, very special, very, very thin Tank JC. So when you are looking for a Tank JC, it might be worth your while, bearing in mind the super thins. It probably will drive you mad because you're now going to say, oh, I only want a super thin, and you weren't going to be able to find a super thin. But I think it is an interesting aspect which most people don't know about Cartier watches, and I'm happy to share it with you here. And if you ever need a super thin, start with us, because I do buy them wherever I can, and I'm always delighted to own them. But as I say, they are hard to find. So I hope, coming back to seeing this new video, we've reinvigorated you all in your interest of all things Cartier, but particularly into Cartier watches. And we look forward to trying to rustle up some further models of interest which will intrigue you. Bye.